So, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us in this keynote presentation by Stuart Karabenick. It is my great privilege to introduce to you the well-known to the academic world and all the SIG motivation and emotion members, Stuart. I will not talk about his academic merits because everybody knows it. I don't have to say anything more than what the facts already indicate. But I will just bring to you some of my memories when we first met with Stuart. Stuart joined the SIG in 2003 after Paul Pintridge passed away. At that point, it was very difficult to foresee how the loss could be overcome. And then Stuart came. He knew very few people at the beginning, but his gentle, kind, constructive personality and solid research background proved critical for being immediately accepted as someone we knew all along. I was fortunate to have him as associate editor during my editorship in Learning and Instruction. He and the other associate editors were instrumental for establishing Learning and Instruction as one of the leading journals in the field. I'm also happy to having witnessed his leadership of the SIG and the wealth of ideas and initiatives he and his co-coordinators brought to the SIG. Well, I will just mention another incident. I wasn't sure if I wanted to say it or not, but I will. So, at some point, yes. I think it was in Amsterdam. Stuart was with a young PhD student in the SIG meeting, and I welcomed her to the family of the SIG. It was not an exaggeration. This is the spirit of the SIG, and Stuart served it gracefully. I don't want to be more sentimental. I would just ask Stuart to take the floor. Thank you very much, and we are looking forward to that.
Now it's okay.
Okay, thank you very much. 2003 was a pivotal year, and when I came in to talk about Paul Pintridge, it was a very difficult time for all of us, and it brought me to early, and especially brought me to the SIG, and was fortunate enough a few years later to be co-coordinator with Moral Wisnitsa. Those are pivotal years. And so really, my being here is a function of that transition. Today, I want to talk about, as it says, motivation, self-regulation strategies in the special case of help seeking. And this is what I'll present. I want to also say before I start that some of this is going to overlap with the presentation that she gave earlier, which is appropriate. But this is what I'd like to do. Briefly review what I call the classical model of motivation and self-regulated learning, with a focus on expectancy value theory and the introduction of cost. Introduce something called strategy motivation. Propose what I call the dual model that combines domain, task, and strategy motivation. And focus on help seeking, specifically sources of help. Say a little bit about technology and social influences, and talk about reframing help seeking as a resource management strategy, which is different than it has been cast typically as a social self-regulated learning strategy. And then some conclusions, suggestions, and next steps. So, what's the extent of motivational influences on self-regulated learning? It's extensive. If you look around, there are all kinds of lists, ways in which motivation and self-regulated learning are combined. I found this one, this list from Barry Zimmerman's work, and along with Dale Schonk. Goal orientation, interest, self-efficacy, outcome expectancy, future time perspective, task values, volition, so on and so on and so on. There are endless forms of motivation that you'll find in the literature to supposedly link with and also influence the use of learning strategies. So, to overlap with Anastasi's, I'm looking at the top part of the model, right? Just the person part. For the person level of her model, and picked out the constructs there: self-concept, ability, control beliefs, and affect. I don't think I've missed anything, but that's in her model. And then, of course, Monique's work, and again, I picked out some of the constructs out of her work: motivational self-regulation, capacity beliefs, goal orientation, attitudes and values related to tasks within a domain, negative emotions, and effort avoidance. Now that's only a small part of her model. And also Winnie and Hadwin, the COPES model, which is quite different and looks at motivational factors within the task. It's very, very different. The trace perspective, but motivation is still in there, of course. Now, I know some of you are, because we talked about it, but who knows what this is? Ah, you cheater. Thanks, Avi. This is one of the most significant articles. There you go. There's Paul. The skill and the will, motivation and the MSOQ. And the last time I looked in Google Scholar, over 6,500 citations. Right? You should be so influential. But you can't talk about this without having that as a part of it, because of his influence. And that's the these are the relationships. Not very many, but it was enough, and it brought skill and the will together, and that's what he focused on all his life. So the MSOQ motivation scales are listed here. And as you see, value components: intrinsic, extrinsic, goal orientation, task value, expectancy components, control beliefs, self-efficacy for learning and performance, and affective components, test anxiety. It covers a lot, but it was really the beginning, and we now know a lot more. And these are the learning strategy scales. The cognitive ones are what we call low value or shallow. People differ in how they categorize these, but that's one group. Of rehearsal, memorization, and organization. High value or deep strategy use, critical thinking and elaboration. And then a category called resource management, in which there was help-seeking, effort regulation, time and study environment, peer learning, and finally there was metacognition, and often put together because they often factor it together, but I just list them separately: planning, monitoring, and regulating. So that was the MSOQ. which was extremely influential. So this is the classical model of domain, task, motivation, and self-regulation strategies, self-regulated learning strategies. So what you have is a domain or a task. Now, the domain could be math or social studies or whatever, and or the task could be some task. And then there's a direct influence, but what you have is self-regulated learning strategies as mediating or an indirect influence on some outcome. That's the classical model, right? All right, right there. That's the link. And that's what we'll focus on. So let's look at some examples. This achievement goal theory. There's Chris Walters, who is, hope Chris is here, has done a major amount of the work on motivation and self-regulated learning. This is in 2004. And these are, the bars represent the strength of the correlation. So you have performance avoid. Notice that it is not very much. In fact, it's a negative. Performance approach, slightly positive, and mastery. In this case, mastery learning. So mastery, highly related to the use of both metacognitive and cognitive strategies. Typical, and that's what you typically find. Not to leave SDT out, here are a set of relations with, and the strategies are information. Processing, selecting main ideas, and time management. And you can see all the forms of regulation are positive, as you would expect, and the only one that's negative is external regulation. So actually find a negative relationship. So if you're engaged in a task in which there's rewards and punishments, and you're forced to do it, there's actually can be a negative correlation. Expectancy value theory, and here we have work by Connie Zusho and Paul and Brian Coppola. These are introductory chemistry university students, and there you see relationships, especially elaboration is related to the use of strategies. Well, elaboration is strategy, motivation, efficacy, value, and interest. So they vary quite a bit. Okay. And this is one I actually did with a clinician. And Paul and I had a bet, which I won. He didn't think that we could pull it off, and didn't think that we could find a mediation between learning strategies, between psychopathology and academic performance. And nevertheless, we were able to show with some trimming a relationship between how the use of strategies mediated the relationship or the indirect relations. So quite a variety, to say the least. So if you look at it strategically, you see this consistency across a lot of theoretical perspectives and strategies. And now, with expectancy value theory, an increase in the addition of cost. And of course, using strategies is costly, so you'd expect some kind of relationship. But that's really a recent phenomenon. Back, Avi's sitting there, so there's Perez, Cromley, and Kaplan that looked at this recently. But we did some, Jean-Louis Berger and I did a study in math class. You can see the details of the study. And we included cost. So here's what I'll show you. These are relations, and so this is the relation between math. Now it's math efficacy. Important that you understand that. Efficacy for math and the use of elaboration, metacognition especially, time and study, help-seeking, rehearsal, and organization. That's efficacy. Math value, the usual combination of components of math value and strategy use, especially time study. Notice they're not the same. Okay, they're different. And this is math cost. So again, you see different relationships depending on the component of the expectancy value theory, which part you're looking at, and the strategy and which strategy it is. So it does depend on which. And what you see there, time and study management, is inversely related to cost. So people think it's not as costly, you're going to use time and study management more. So it makes sense, right? Okay. So no question that domain or task motivation is related to strategy use. Motivation influences the use of self-regulated learning strategies, but a more fine-grained analysis is clearly necessary since the relation depends on the specific strategy, the theoretical frame, specific components of the frame, and also grain size. So you have to take that into consideration. Even within math, the algebra might differ than solving simultaneous equations. Okay? Now, what about other motivational influences? Most of the literature is about what I just showed you, about task and domain. What about influences at the strategy level? I thought, well, this is a unique idea until I went back and looked at a lot of the early work many years ago. A lot of it, Scott Paris and colleagues. And he used the term, or they used the term strategy value information, which is information about the usefulness of a strategy as an aid to performance. So we're not talking about domains of math. We're talking about the strategy, which is not the same thing. How do learners view the relative benefits and costs of using different strategies? And how are those appraisals related to strategy use is the question. For example, generally assume that lower-level cognitive strategies such as rehearsal are easier to use and less costly to use than our higher-level strategies like elaboration. So we often assume that. More cost with newly acquired strategies, which decreases with automaticity. So kind of a general idea of how these could play out. So the influence of strategy motivation, here we have the categories of strategies that I talked about before. And this is the model, right? So you have motivation for strategies, right? And then you have the, I don't have the whole part of the model, the indirect, direct as far as the indirect relationship, but that's basically it. So some evidence that using an expectancy value approach to strategy motivation, this is the study. This is a 9th grade math sample, and you can see the details. We compared utility, cost, and use. Now, notice we didn't have efficacy because we didn't want to ask students, so many things at once. So we picked utility and cost. Utility was how much you believe each way of studying would be useful for doing well in math. Cost, and this is important because we don't have the full range of costs, but how much you believe studying in different ways takes time and effort. So it's the time and effort part of cost. And then, and this is self-reported strategy use. So I know there are problems with that, but let's bypass that for now. And this is what you see, perceived utility value of a strategy. Regulating is actually very high as is help-seeking, and they can see it goes down to planning. So there are differences in the perceived utility of strategies, and that we had to demonstrate, right? And help-seeking and regulating was high. I was glad to see the help-seeking was there. But notice that help-seeking and regulating are really together, and that's important. And this is the perceived cost of the strategy. And notice which one is the highest. Would you have expected that? According to the literature, you may not have expected that, right? So memorization is supposed to be this low-level strategy, and yet is the highest cost. All right, so this is combining them. You can just combine them, subtract one from the other, and then this is what you have. Help-seeking is up there at the top. Regulating, elaboration, and down to organization, which is actually has a negative value if you subtract these. Help-seeking is up there. So now let's look at the relationship between those motivational estimates or appraisals and use. And you see that they're related. So we now have a relationship between reported use, utility and cost, and reported use. Pretty highly related, right? There's another way you could look at it. Now this is over the whole sample. There may be differences across different parts of the sample and so on, different math classes. But that's a pretty striking relationship. If you look at the motivation for strategies, again, it's not math, it's for the strategy. So there's some evidence that they're related. Right? So independent of domain task motivation, evidence that the appraised utility and cost of using strategies themselves is related to the reported use. Some surprises. For example, rehearsal, as I said before, often considered a low-level or easy strategy to employ, with some references, was judged very costly. Interesting that both help-seeking and regulating, both of which involve activities contingent on monitoring judgments, are quite close together. So there's some components of each that suggest that they might be close together. And in general, there is something to learn by focusing on strategy motivation. All right, now, what about the combination of domain task and strategy motivation, you might ask? Can you put these things together? So let's look at a dual domain task and strategy motivation model. Here's what you had before, and here's what you can have now. Okay? So this is a dual model. What it would look like if we put these things together. We have the domain and we have the strategy motivation, and let's look at that. So consider a dual model using achievement goal theory. Now I thought this was a unique, wonderful, creative idea until I went back in the literature and with some due diligence found out that before she got swept up into situative perspectives, Susan Nolan, who was at that time looking at learning strategies from the achievement goal perspective, this is what she looked at. This is her model. Now, she was interested at the time in adding achievement goal orientation and looking at self-regulated learning, use of learning strategies. So she actually anticipated this, 30 years. Okay, so I wanted to make sure that I gave her full credit for this. All right, so let's look at the current data and the current model. So what you're looking at in these models is, let's say, math value and cost, and its influence on strategy value and cost, and then strategy use. So you've got direct and indirect or mediated paths. Right? And that comes directly from the dual model. Right? So if you look at math and rehearsal utility, this is what you find. So if you look at this path model, you find that it's basically mediated. Okay? So an indirect effect of the domain math and its relationship to reported rehearsal use, mediated by perceived rehearsal utility. So again, there's a role to be played by motivation for the strategy, looked at this way. Let's look at cost. And here, cost is directly related, math cost is directly related to reported rehearsal use, and it's not mediated. So there are differences depending on what you look at. Then here is looking at utility minus cost. Remember, we did this before. And then you show just a direct relationship between perceived rehearsal utility minus cost and reported use. So depending on what you look at, it changes, it varies. So here's math. I'm just picking out a couple of strategies. I'm not showing all of them. There's math and metacognition utility. And here you see it's primarily mediated, primarily an indirect path, although there's a significant path between math utility and use, a lot of the explanation is direct influence of math utility to perceived metacognition utility, and then a direct path to use. Okay. Here's math and metacognition cost. And again, it's different. Basically, all of these are different. And that's I'm not surprised, really, but it shows that you have to look at the specific motivational component and the specific strategy, something I'll come back to later. Okay. And this is utility minus cost. And again, you see, in this case, as opposed to before, it's all mediated and not direct. So, contribution of dual model to the study of motivation, self-regulated learning, need for renewed focus on strategy motivation. We are missing important motivational influences by not including both strategy and domain task motivation, which we've been missing for a long time. It's clear that direct and mediated effects of motivation strategies vary across strategies, as I said before. Let's say rehearsal versus metacognition. And the expectancy value framework, value cost approach. Again, something I'll come back to later. So need for research across domains, let's say math versus social studies as well. Okay. Well, no surprise if you know my work. This is the special case of help seeking. Here's our little model. And why so special? Well, research on help seeking already fits the dual motivation self-regulated learning model. Help seeking is more likely to involve personal cost, something we didn't include before, for example, embarrassment, as well as time and effort and opportunity cost. The major focus is on the negative as well as the positive consequences of not seeking, as well as seeking help, i.e. not using the strategy. So they're both, really. And there's, as you'll see in a second, there's a complex internal structure or process of components potentially influenced by motivation, and I'll show you what those are in a second. And often involve social interaction-related costs. Now, if you look at the other strategies, well, there's peer learning, but really the amount of social interaction in the other strategies is incidental. I mean, I suppose you could rehearse in front of an audience. I suppose you could. But the other strategies, by and large, don't involve social interaction, and that's a major difference between help-seeking and the other strategies, except you'll see later that I kind of counter that a little when we get to technology, but let's leave that for a while. Okay. And there are different types of help-seeking. That's the third. That's another point. So let's look at the types of help-seeking. You can see that we have a lot of different labels and types, but generally we think of those that are less desirable, and these are different labels. Executive help-seeking is something that reflects the use of help-seeking to avoid work, for example. Let somebody else do it. Convenient, another label for that. Dependent, work avoidant, excessive, expedient, ability focus, and avoidant. Okay. More desirable, what we call instrumental help-seeking. Now, that's what Sharon Nelson-Legal focused on when she really changed the entire field of help-seeking in the early 1980s, saying that there is some help-seeking that's not just work avoidant or dependent, but is important to make progress if you're faced by some difficulties that you can't overcome alone. And she talked about that as a developmental, something you develop over time. It's a part of being able to learn better, and change the entire field of help seeking. Also necessary, that's another way. It's necessary, it's not unnecessary, but it's necessary. It's appropriate, it's adaptive, strategic, autonomous. Now, these vary slightly depending on whose work you're looking at. As I'll say, I might as well say it now. A lot of this work is attributable to Ruth Butler's work, and I'll just say it now. At some point I was, but Ruth, I'll tell you, because she's done a lot of this work, and conceptually and empirically. So I wanted to mention that. Much of the research on help seeking involves personal achievement goals. And so this is a compilation, if you will, across studies. And what you find is that if you look at mastery orientation, you find it's mostly correlated with adaptive or instrumental learning. And in some studies, inversely related to help-seeking avoidance. If you look at performance avoid, that's pretty straightforward, negatively related to adaptive and instrumental help-seeking, and positively related to avoid or executive expedient help-seeking. And work avoidance is related to executive expedient help-seeking. It's pretty much what you'd expect. Okay, so I wanted to start off at that level. All right. So this is another way of looking at the relationship between strategy, motivation, and help-seeking. In this context, it's person characteristics and situational characteristics that have an impact on the perceived benefits and costs of seeking and not seeking help. And that is related to different forms of help seeking. So it's not just simple. It's got more complexity to it. So what are these benefits? Problem solved, goals accomplished, acquire increased knowledge and skills, less time and effort in the case of executive or dependent help seeking. Not the most adaptive thing to do, but that could have a benefit depending on the type of help seeking. What are the costs? Time and effort, similar to the other strategies. Self-threat, ego cost, attainment cost, viewing self as dependent. So if you want to look at attainment in expectancy value theory, I think that's where that would fit. Social cost, embarrassment, don't want to look stupid. Incurred helper indebtedness, you ask somebody for help and you're somewhat indebted. Need for reciprocity, for example. For example, more important for strangers than for peers, because for peers maybe you don't, if it's that close relationship, such indebtedness may not be as important. Okay, benefits and costs of not seeking help. Right. Skill, knowledge, and gain from persistence, pride, and autonomous accomplishment. I did it myself. Costs. Not accomplishing goals. Getting lost. Real Greek men don't ask for help. And I even found that just recently. I used to use another example, but I just found this recently that Einstein just sat on his major work because he, for whatever reason, didn't want to ask other people for help with this problem, because there was an error in the mathematics. And a couple of other people, I just took out the names of a couple other people, could have scooped him. So we wouldn't be talking about Einstein theory, we'd be talking about Smith and Jones theory of relativity and so on. Because he didn't. Now it's no or indication of why he didn't. Maybe he was too proud. Who knows? Okay, so there you go. So now let's look at the expectancy value strategy level predictors of different forms of help seeking and not seeking help. These are college students, some data, some published data. So if you look at efficacy, it's positively related to instrumental help seeking, not related to executive help seeking. It's negatively related to, to avoidance of help-seeking and autonomous help-seeking. Help-seeking value as you might imagine, is related to seeking executive help. Now remember, executive help is not the same thing as instrumental. So executive help is you want to avoid work, all right? You want to get something done without having to do it yourself. So it's positively related, and also positively related to avoidance, not seeking help, positively related, and autonomous help. So that's the strategy, now the strategy level, not the domain level. Now let's look at help-seeking utility and cost in the dual model. Let's come back to the same model that we had before. And what you find is, in the case of utility, it's all mediated. So combine math class and strategy utility, you find that it's all mediated. Again, it's different depending on what you're looking at. No direct, if you include perceived help-seeking utility, then you don't find a direct path. So that's the model. In the case of cost, really, there's only a direct path between math class cost and perceived strategy cost, and none of the other two paths, neither of the other two paths are significant. So again, a different set. So cost doesn't really matter in this case, except as math class cost is related at a very low level to perceived strategy costs. And then if you take the two together, then you find this pretty similar to utility, because cost doesn't really have strong relationships. So again, you find this mediated path. So again, some strategies you find mediated, some you find you direct. It depends. And that's one of the keys. And as I'll say later, that's one of the important parts of finding that it isn't across everything. It isn't the same. And therefore, it can be more useful. Now let's look at something else. The help-seeking process and the focus on sources, as you'll see. This just looks at the process of help-seeking, and it turns out there are potentially benefits and costs at each stage of the help-seeking process. This is a typical way in which help-seeking is looked at, determine that a problem exists, determine that help is needed. Now we're into metacognition land. Decide to seek help and types of help, scan potential sources of help, which I'll come back to in a second, decide from whom or where to seek help, solicit the help, obtain the help, and process the help. Now, a lot of this has been looked at. However, this is the part that I think is important to look at in the present context. And that is the sources of help, because therein lies a lot of cost-benefit relationships, right? All right. So one of the things you should notice that this deciding to seek help and type of help is not in this box, but in a way it should be, because when you're making the decision, you're looking at sources. In fact, it's important to mention that even though this is an arrow going from left to right, it's not that. The stages can happen in varying orders, with varying degrees of salience. And so it doesn't look as neat as it is. A lot of the models of help-seeking make it seem like it's all unidirectional, but it's not unidirectional. Some of this is probably non-conscious. Probably a lot of it is non-conscious. And so just don't think of it that way. But I want to, again, focus on sources of help, because as I said, therein lies some of the application of the model. So what are the sources? Pre-K, parents, family, friends, other personal sources. A lot of this work was really done by Richard Newman, who was one of the pioneers in the development of the developmental processes involved with sources of help, again, as well as all other aspects of the development of help seeking with young children especially. And K-12, it's teachers and peers and parents, and now online, of course. And in university settings, as I'll talk about in a few minutes, the proliferation of sources of help. So one look, and Kara looked at this and found 88 sources of help listed on the site, the Academic Support Services website, and there's probably more now. It's a couple of years ago, and it's just a lot of sources out there. We'll come back to that, and ways to access them, of course. And you got email and course management systems, web search, online databases, social networking sites, and the rest. Okay. So just to look, if this is one example, if you were having a problem understanding your schoolwork this year, how likely is it that you would seek help from the following people? This was done in a high school setting. This is Kara's work and mine. And you notice the more you believe in the benefits of help seeking, obviously it'd be related to your seeking help from friends, non-friends, teachers, other teachers, and strongly to teachers. And this wasn't a given, not absolutely necessary. Teachers would be the strongest. Friends, for example. So this is the way it turned out. But notice what the cost relationship is with classroom teachers. Right? So the more you think there are costs of help seeking, the less you would seek help from teachers. Makes sense, I suppose, but that's what we found. Now, another way of looking at this is to look at the rated importance of benefits and costs with respect to source characteristics, and this is done in a university setting. It wasn't absolutely clear how this was going to work out. This is new data. And so it seemed important to look at this. So we're not talking directly about, cost benefits. We're talking about the importance of these. And so the more importance, according to the university students, had the specific information or advice you needed, was likely to respond to your request for help, would adapt the help to respond to your specific needs. So it's just a pretty general list, right? And notice the one that is on the bottom. Now, at least they're not confessing this. So it might be the case that they are concerned about that, but not going to tell you that. So this came out on the bottom, although it wasn't necessary. It would be predicted to be the case. Okay. Let's look at rearrange them a little bit and look at the relationship between again, this is expectancy value theory, and we look at expectancy value and cost and how that relates to the various characteristics. Okay? So in the case of expectancy, it's negatively related to whether the source would make you feel anxious or embarrassed asking for help. Makes perfectly good sense. But value is different, right? In the case of value, the more you value help seeking, the more important was that the source had the specific information or advice you needed and would adapt the help to respond to your specific needs. So that's separate, very different. And cost is positively related to, would require a lot of time and effort, and even more highly related to anxiety and embarrassment. Very, very straightforward, very predictable. But I wasn't sure whether the value relationships, or where they would come out. I really had no prediction about that. And those are just some of the highlighting these. All right, these are source preferences. Imagine you were having a problem understanding something in one of your typical college classes. How likely would you be to do each of the following in order to get help? And this is, again, work that Kara and I did. And you'll notice that that was the highest one. Refer to class materials, use outline, search encyclopedia. So here we're getting into the technology aspects of this, because these are easy, right? These are easy. And some, face-to-face versus technology-mediated. All right, here's another way of looking at of cost. And this is social-related cost. And you're going to look at some sources with different potential degrees of cost. But I wanted to just put up and show you the Gordon Allport's definition of what's social, because people have different definitions of what's social. So actual, imagined, or implied presence of other human beings. So consider carefully what those three are. Actual, face-to-face, or I suppose it could be FaceTime or other technology-mediated. But the other is imagined. Imagine what your mother would think, or implied. So sometimes, you get a grade, or you have some outcome, and there's an implication of some social connection there. So it's a very broad definition of what is social, but I thought a useful one. So let's look at some of these costs. Potentially more costs. This is not technology. This is sort of the end of the continuum. And the classrooms, of course, when you have your face-to-face. Although these days you don't have to be, because you can interact with instructors online. There's online tutors that are possible, and Minna Pustinen, for example, has done a lot of work with online tutoring. Then there's synchronous and asynchronous computer-mediated communication, Skype, Facebook, Twitter, the whole gamut. Intelligent learning environments, help-seeking tutors. I went by too fast, but and those, for example, I see Alvin who's listed. This is Vince Alvin at Carnegie Mellon, and his team rather have done a lot of work with the cognitive tutor, and along with that, the help-seeking tutor, a very sophisticated Bayesian system that delivers context-sensitive help, and they've been doing a lot of work. What they find out, I'll just tell you incidentally, what they find out is that people abuse the system. They do what's called bottoming out. So you have different levels of help that you can get, and a lot of them, they just click through. Sound familiar? They just click through. Give me the answer. So that's executive help. Then, of course, you have Wikipedia, Google, Siri, and now you have Amazon Echo, so you don't even have to leave your living room. You can just say, Echo, what's the answer to number 5 on my homework? And I mean, it's all over the place, which is important. It's going to have, as you'll see in a second, really important in another way, which I'll get to. Yeah, so you have all the technology available, which really decreases the potential social costs. Now here's an example. This is the first study I did, experimental study I did in help seeking. I love it, even though it's old. But as far as I could tell, it's the first study of its kind. So you can get help. It was labeled source privacy. Is the whole idea of help-seeking privacy. And that's the great thing about, one of the great things about using technology is you can do it in the privacy of your own whatever. And you just ask. If you get it wrong, you get it wrong, and nobody cares. It's not connected to anything. If it's not connected to anything, or if you think it's not connected to anything, right? So I looked at made up a task, and it's on the computer, and people do it. It's a concept formation task, and it was all programmed and fixed, and I could make them fail, and it was terrible. I could make them fail, but that was typical. And the question was to see if they got help. So so it was either directly connected to a computer, or the other condition was we told them, good social psych study, we told them that it was the help, actually, you actually got the help from an assistant who was in the other room. Of course, there was no assistant in the other room. This was all pre-programmed, and there's no difference. There was no difference in the performance of these students. They would fail at the same level. And this was all checked, of course. So this is what we found. When you looked at the condition of computer help, only computer help, then 86% requested help at least once, and the mean number of help requests is 3.5. So, and about less than half the number were interpersonal help. But you know, we kind of know this, but this is the first experimental test of it, and because I just wanted to see if we can sort of duplicate what we found in correlation studies. Okay. All right, so now we come, you know, years and years and years ahead, and I could show you lots of other examples, but this is with MOOCs, and this is Iris Howley, who did a dissertation at Carnegie Mellon, and she was looking at the sources of help and what's called a help-seeking tutor in MOOCs, and the information the students were given is that these were good helpers or better help seekers, help givers, and this was indicated by badges, if you know what badges are. Okay, so badges indicating the level of expertise. Okay, so you had helpers, the condition with the helper badges or no helper badges, and then another condition was whether the helper would vote on your question. And this is called up and down voting. And there are MOOCs and other situations where you have up and down voting. And so the question was how this would affect their asking questions. Well, it turned out when there's badges, up and down voting didn't matter. But when there were no badges, then up and down voting did matter. So there was no voting, then you had higher levels of asking for help. When there's voting, you got lower levels. Quite predictable, but Iris did a nice job of showing these relationships. I want to look at help-seeking viewed as resource management. Typically, it's been looked at as a social, as I said, a social self-regulated learning strategy. And this is just one example. I could show you others. By definition, such behavior involves interpersonal interaction. But many sources are barely or arguably non-social. A better classification would be obtaining external resources that an individual or a group of individuals determines are needed to accomplish goals. And again, you don't have, especially today with technology, you don't need a lot of social interaction. So a lot of help out there. So perhaps seen as less costly because of the lack of social interaction. Okay. Now, what? You didn't get help? I found this on one of the websites. I mean, this is getting a little touchy-feely, I thought. You know, we're really in a different era. And with all that help out there, let's join hands and sing Kumbaya. And we'll all get help and so on. So what does that mean? It's possible that the plethora of available resources potentially increases the cost of not getting help. The expectation that you should take advantage of helping resources, we are in a different era, I think. And I think this is actually a possibility. I haven't done research on it, but I think it's a possibility. In sum, reviewed the classical approach to motivation and self-regulated learning, focused on expectancy value theory, and reduced the effects of cost, reintroduced, because this was available before, strategy motivation as a predictor of strategy use, presented a model that incorporates both domain task and strategy motivation as predictors of strategy use, That's our little model. Tested the model on specific strategies using expectancy value theory, focus on the special case of help seeking, specifically sources of help, and briefly reviewed how technology can reduce source costs. Okay, so I suggest that from what we know so far, that achievement goal theory and self-determination theory and interest theory are more relevant at the domain level. For example, math motivation, that's the example we used. But expectancy value theory is applicable both at the domain level and the strategy level. And the reason is that this cost benefit is more built into expectancy value theory than achievement goal theory or self-determination theory, and even interest, because interest is usually positive, not negative. So expectancy value, at least that's my argument, expectancy value theory is more flexible in that way. Right? And that's a topic of future study. Is that the case? The other, and I was reminded about this and wanted to stress it after being in this great session on context, and so I had to throw this in Avi. I couldn't resist. Likely that the direct and indirect influences of motivation and self-regulation theory will vary depending both on the domain and the strategy, as I said before. In fact, the strength of the dual model consists of detecting such differences. We want to know if motivation effects differ for math and social studies, for example, and that the strategy motivation effects differ, let's say, for elaboration versus rehearsal. So in other words, generalizing, those specific values is not the primary goal. In fact, it's quite the opposite. So that's a little different take on, I think, the consequences of what I've been working on. Okay. And finally, it's worth the consideration of considering the implications of these ideas for current motivation interventions. What's the connection? Well, is increasing the will, and this is not a unique idea, by the way. Is increasing the will sufficient, or should interventions also focus on ensuring sufficient levels of skill as well? For example, now that we've convinced you that math is more important, here are some strategies that will help you perform better. So is it necessary to do that? If I tell you that math is wonderful and so on, if I don't tell you something, or if you don't have a certain, strategy abilities, that can be frustrating, it can be detrimental. Perhaps the model and evidence presented here will help to answer that question. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I think connecting the two different research traditions, I think it's a very big step forward. So thank you very much for your inspiring lecture. We can have 5 minutes for questions, 1 or 2 questions perhaps.
I just question Stuart.
Okay.
No, I don't need that. Can you tell me what you see as the difference between what you're calling strategy motivation, or the metacognitive literature will talk about as conditional knowledge?
There's similarities. Yeah, it's similarities. If you go back to Scott Paris's work, I mean, knowing its strategic ability. It's also, conditional, right? When to use a strategy. It's really, it has a lot of overlap with that. There's no question about that.
So do you see an advantage about going with one term or another?
I'm not convinced. I don't know the answer to that. I really don't. And I think I'm not. Let me just use it. I'm not surprised that you would ask these questions. And I knew that when I was doing this, that you and I were going to have some conversations. And I was really hoping that because